The morning alarm bells rang across station, sending vibrations through the metal floors that every cadet could feel in their bones. Sarah rolled out of her narrow bunk and looked at the time display on her wall. Today was the day she had been both waiting for and dreading for months. The Galactic Military Academy final exam. Sarah pulled on her gray cadet uniform and tied her black hair into a neat ponytail. Around her, the dormitory buzzed with nervous energy. Her roommate, a tall name with blue-green skin and 4 arms, was already packing her study materials into a bag with all 4 hands moving at once. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, her voice making the musical sounds that all made when they spoke. "I have been studying the battle records for 6 months straight." Sarah nodded and grabbed her own bag. "As ready as I can be, I guess." The truth was that Sarah felt different from most of her classmates. She was one of only 3 humans in her class of 47 cadets. The rest came from all over the galaxy with their incredible memory skills, who could see patterns that others missed, who had been warriors for thousands of years, and many others. Each species brought their own special abilities to military strategy. Humans, according to most of the galaxy, brought very little. Sarah walked through the corridors of station toward the main classroom. The station was huge, floating in space between 3 different star systems. It had been built as neutral ground where all the species could come together to learn military science. The walls were covered with pictures and statues of famous military leaders from across the galaxy. As she walked, Sarah passed a group of cadets. They were tall, with 4 legs like horses, but their upper bodies looked somewhat human except for their faces, which had mandibles like insects. They were talking in their clicking language about battle formations they had memorized. "The humans will fail today," one of them said in Galactic Standard, the language everyone used to talk to each other. "They have no real military tradition. Earth has been at peace for 300 years. Sarah kept walking, but she felt her face get hot. She was used to comments like this, but they still bothered her. It was true that humans were the members of galactic society. It was also true that Earth had been peaceful for a long time, but Sarah knew there was more to human history than most aliens understood. She entered the main classroom and took her usual seat in the middle section. The room was enormous, with seats that could adjust to fit the different body types of all the species. The front wall was covered by a massive holographic display that could show anything from star maps to battle simulations. Other students filed in, talking quietly among themselves. Sarah noticed that most of them sat with their own species. They clustered together, comparing notes with their perfect memories. They sat in a group, their large eyes already scanning the room for patterns and clues about what the exam might contain. Near the back, Sarah saw the other 2 humans in her class. Was a big guy from the Mars colonies who wanted to be a ship engineer. Jenny came from Europa Station and specialized in logistics. Both of them gave Sarah small waves, but they all sat separately. It had become clear early in their training that they were expected to succeed or fail on their own merits, not as a group. The room fell silent when Professor entered. He was a who had fought in 3 different wars before becoming a teacher. His face was from an old battle, and his mandibles clicked when he was thinking. Everyone respected him, but he was also known for being very tough on students. Professor walked to the front of the room without saying anything. His 4 legs moved in perfect rhythm, and his military bearing made it clear why he had been such a successful commander. He stopped in front of the holographic display and turned to face the class. "Cadets," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "Today you will take your final examination in strategic warfare analysis. This exam will determine whether you graduate from this academy and earn the right to serve as officers in the Galactic Defense Force." Sarah felt her heart beat faster. She had worked for 2 years to get to this point. Her family on Earth had made sacrifices to send her here. She could not afford to fail. "The examination is simple," Professor continued. You will be presented with historical battle data. Your task is to analyze the tactics used and identify the commander who achieved victory. You will have 4 hours to complete your analysis and present your conclusions. This was what Sarah had expected. The academy was famous for this type of exam. Students had to prove they could think like great military leaders by studying how those leaders had won their most famous battles. Professor touched a control panel, and the holographic display came to life. It showed a three-dimensional map of space with stars, planets, and the paths that spaceships had taken during some ancient battle. Sarah could see debris fields, the remains of destroyed vessels, and the tactical positions that different fleets had taken. This, the professor said, is the aftermath of the Battle of Crimson Nebula, fought 297 years ago. It is considered by most military historians to be the greatest tactical victory in recorded galactic history. Sarah studied the display carefully. She could see that one fleet had been much smaller than the other, but somehow the smaller fleet had completely destroyed the larger one. The positioning looked impossible. The smaller fleet should have been wiped out within minutes. One commander achieved the impossible in this battle, Professor continued. With a force of only 23 ships, they destroyed an enemy armada of over 200 vessels. Not a single enemy ship escaped. The victory changed the course of the Third Galactic War and saved an entire world from invasion. Murmurs went around the classroom. Sarah had heard of this battle before, but she had never studied it in detail. It was the kind of victory that military academies used as an example of perfect strategy and timing. Your task is to determine who commanded the victorious fleet. You may use any historical databases, tactical analysis software, and reference materials available to you. Begin now. The examination had started. Around her, Sarah could hear other students immediately getting to work. Computer screens lit up as cadets began accessing historical records and battle analysis programs. She could hear the rapid clicking of mandibles as they processed information, and the soft humming sounds that made when they were using their enhanced memory abilities. Sarah took a deep breath and began to study the battle display more carefully. Something about the tactical pattern seemed familiar to her, but she could not quite figure out what it was. She had a feeling that this examination was going to be more challenging than any of them had expected. Sarah stared at the holographic display for several minutes, trying to understand what she was seeing. The battle map showed the final positions of all the ships after the fighting had ended, but she needed to figure out how the battle had actually happened. She activated her personal computer screen and began accessing the historical database. Information flowed across her display: ship types, weapon specifications, crew numbers, and timeline data. The more she read, the more confused she became. According to the records, the winning fleet had been by more than 8-1. Their ships were smaller, older, and carried less powerful weapons. By every logical measure, they should have been completely destroyed in the first few minutes of fighting. Around her, Sarah could see that her classmates were having the same problem. She watched, working with 3 of her 4 hands moving across different screens, while her 4th hand took notes. This face showed concentration as she used her species' perfect memory to compare this battle with thousands of others she had studied. At a nearby desk, a group of cadets had formed a study cluster. They were clicking their mandibles rapidly as they shared information and built complex tactical models. Sarah could see mathematical equations floating above their screens as they tried to work out how the smaller fleet could have possibly won. The students were using their natural pattern recognition abilities in a different way. Their large eyes could see details that other species missed, and they were tracing the movement paths of individual ships, looking for clues in the way the battle had developed. Sarah realized that every other species was approaching this problem by using their natural strengths. They used their perfect memory to compare this battle with every other battle in history. They used their mathematical minds to build models and run calculations. They used their pattern recognition to see things others could not see. But what natural strength did humans have? Sarah had been asking herself this question for 2 years at the academy. Humans were not the strongest, fastest, or most technologically advanced species in the galaxy. So why was she here? She decided to approach the problem differently. Instead of trying to figure out the technical details of how the battle was won, she started thinking about why it was fought in the first place. Sarah accessed the historical records about the Third Galactic War. She learned that the battle had taken place near a planet called Prime, which was home to several billion people. An enemy fleet had been sent to invade the planet and enslave its population. The small defending fleet was all that stood between the invaders and innocent civilians. This changed everything for Sarah. This was not just a military exercise or a territorial dispute. This was about survival. Someone had been defending their home, their families, their entire way of life. She began to study the battle with this new understanding. The tactical moves that looked impossible or crazy from a military standpoint began to make sense when she thought of them as the actions of someone who absolutely could not afford to lose. The winning commander had used tactics that no military academy would ever teach. Ships had been sent on suicide missions that somehow were not actually suicide missions. Retreats had been ordered that turned into attacks from unexpected directions. The entire battle plan seemed to ignore basic rules of military strategy. But Sarah realized that the rules of military strategy were written by people who had other options. They were written by commanders who could retreat to fight another day, who could accept partial defeat in exchange for preserving their forces, who could make the cold calculations of acceptable losses. The commander at Crimson Nebula had not had any of those options. Sarah looked up from her screen and saw Professor walking among the students. The old warrior stopped near different groups, observing their work but not offering any help. When he passed by Sarah's desk, he paused for a moment. "Interesting approach, cadet," he said quietly, looking at her screen. "Most students focus on the technical aspects of the battle." Sarah looked up at him. "Sir, I think the technical aspects might not be the most important part." Professor's mandibles twitched slightly, which Sarah had learned was the equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "Explain." "Well, sir," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, "most battles are fought between professional military forces who follow established tactics and strategies. But this battle was different. One side was not really a professional military force at all." The professor tilted his head. "What makes you think that?" Sarah pointed to her screen, where she had been analyzing the ship types and crew records. "Look at the winning fleet, sir. The ships are all different types and ages. Some of them are military vessels, but others are converted civilian ships. The crew records show people with jobs like teacher, farmer, engineer, and shop owner. These were not professional soldiers." Professor studied her analysis for a moment. "And what do you conclude from this observation?" "I think this was not really a military battle at all, sir. This was ordinary people fighting to protect their homes and families, and that changes everything about how they would fight." The professor nodded slowly and moved on to observe other students. Sarah felt a small surge of confidence. She was on the right track. She continued her research, but now she was looking for different things. Instead of studying military tactics, she began reading about the people who had fought in the battle. She found personal stories, interviews with survivors, and records of civilian populations who had been evacuated from Prime. What she found painted a very different picture than the official military histories. The defending fleet had been made up mostly of volunteers who had never fought in space before. They had been flying ships that were never meant for combat, using weapons that had been improvised from mining equipment and industrial tools. But they had been fighting for something that professional soldiers rarely fought for. They had been fighting for their children's lives, for their parents' safety, for their homes and everything they loved. Sarah began to understand the tactical decisions that had seemed so crazy. When someone is fighting to protect their family, they will take risks that no professional soldier would ever take. They will sacrifice themselves without hesitation if it means saving others. They will try impossible things because giving up is not an option. She looked at the battle map again, but now she saw it with new eyes. Every move made sense when she understood the motivation behind it. The commander had not been trying to win a military victory. They had been trying to save everyone they cared about. And somehow, impossibly, they had succeeded. Sarah began typing her analysis, but she realized she still did not know who the commander had been. The historical records were frustratingly incomplete. They talked about the battle and its results, but they did not give much detail about the person who had led the defending fleet. She expanded her search, looking for any mention of the battle commander's identity. Most sources just referred to the defending commander or the fleet admiral. A few mentioned that the commander had been from the planet that was being defended, but they did not give a name. Sarah was starting to feel frustrated when she found something interesting. In a collection of personal memoirs from war veterans, she discovered an interview with someone who had served on one of the defending ships. The interview was old and had been buried in the archives, but it contained a small detail that made Sarah's heart beat faster. The veteran mentioned that their commander had been one of the Earth people and had spoken with the accent of the old North American continent. Sarah stared at the screen. The commander had been human. She quickly searched for more information, but there was very little to find. Humans had only been members of galactic society for about 400 years, and their early military records were not well preserved in the galactic databases. But as Sarah continued searching, she began to find small clues scattered throughout the historical records. A mention here, a reference there, all pointing to the same conclusion. The greatest tactical victory in galactic history had been won by a human commander. Sarah sat back in her chair, amazed. Around her, she could see that other students were still struggling with the technical analysis of the battle. They were trying to figure out how someone could win with inferior numbers and equipment, but they were missing the most important fact of all. The commander had not won because of superior technology or brilliant military training. They had won because they were human, and humans fight differently when everything they love is at stake. The 4 hours passed much faster than Sarah had expected. She had been so absorbed in her research that she barely noticed the time until Professor's voice echoed through the classroom. "Time," he announced in his firm military tone. "Close your research programs and prepare to present your conclusions." Sarah felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. She had found evidence that the battle commander was human, but she still did not know exactly who that person had been. Around her, other students were closing their screens and organizing their notes with confident expressions. Professor walked to the front of the classroom and activated the main holographic display again. The battle map appeared, showing the impossible victory that had occurred nearly 3 centuries ago. "You will now present your analyses," the professor said. "Each student will have 5 minutes to explain their conclusions about the identity of the commanding officer who achieved this victory. We will begin with the delegation." A cadet named stood up. He was tall even for and his mandibles clicked confidently as he spoke. "Professor, based on our mathematical analysis of the battle patterns, we have concluded that this victory was achieved by General K of the Third Fleet. The tactical precision and calculated risk assessment match his documented fighting style from the Second Galactic War." Sarah frowned. She had read about General K during her research, and while he was certainly a skilled commander, his style was nothing like what she had seen in the Crimson Nebula battle. K was known for careful planning and minimal casualties, not desperate improvisation. Professor nodded and made notes on his personal screen. "Thank you, Cadet. Next, the delegation stood up, her four arms moving gracefully as she accessed her notes. Professor, we have compared this battle to every recorded engagement in galactic military history. The tactical signature most closely matches that of Admiral Ra of the Defense Corps, who achieved similar impossible victories during the Outer Rim conflicts. Again, Sarah disagreed silently. Admiral Ra had been brilliant, but her victories came from superior memory and planning abilities. The Crimson Nebula battle showed none of that careful preparation. One by one, students from different species stood up and presented their conclusions. The suggested it had been one of their own pattern recognition specialists. The thought it was one of their warrior poets. The hegemony delegates were convinced it had been a collective artificial intelligence. Each analysis was detailed and well-researched, but Sarah could see that they all made the same mistake. Every student was trying to find a commander whose known abilities could explain the impossible victory. They were looking for someone who fit their understanding of how military genius worked. But Sarah had realized that this battle could not be explained by conventional military genius at all. When her turn came, Sarah stood up slowly. She could feel the eyes of all her classmates on her, and she knew that most of them expected her to fail. Humans had no great military tradition to draw from, no famous generals that the galaxy respected. "Professor," she said, "before I give my conclusion, may I ask you a question?" Professor's mandibles twitched with interest. "You may." "This battle," Sarah continued, "it was not really about military strategy, was it? It was about survival, about people fighting for their very existence against impossible odds." The classroom became very quiet. Sarah could see confusion on many faces. Her classmates had been thinking about this as an academic exercise, a puzzle to be solved with logic and research. "The commander who won this battle," Sarah went on, "was not just brilliant. They were desperate. And that desperation led them to make choices that no trained military officer would ever make, because trained officers are taught to preserve their forces and fight another day. But this commander did not have another day." Professor leaned forward slightly. "And what conclusion have you drawn from this analysis, cadet?" Sarah took a deep breath. The Battle of Crimson Nebula was won by a human commander. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed through the chamber, followed by the clicking of mandibles and the musical protests of voices. Sarah heard someone behind her make a sound that she was pretty sure was laughter. "That is impossible," said, standing up from his seat. "Humans had barely achieved space flight at the time of this battle. They had no military experience, no advanced technology, no strategic training." Sarah nodded. "You are absolutely right, and that is exactly why a human commander could win this battle when no one else could." She turned to face the class, feeling more confident now. "Everyone here has been trying to figure out how a professionally trained military genius could achieve this victory. But what if the commander was not professionally trained at all? What if they were just an ordinary person who had to learn warfare because someone was threatening their home?" The classroom buzzed with confused voices. Professor raised one of his hands for silence. "Explain further, cadet." Sarah activated her personal screen and projected her research onto the main display. "Look at the ships in the defending fleet," she said. "They are not all military vessels. Many of them are civilian ships that have been converted for fighting. Mining vessels, cargo haulers, passenger transports. The crew records show people whose normal jobs were teacher, farmer, engineer." She highlighted different parts of the battle map as she spoke. These were not professional soldiers following established tactics. These were ordinary people defending their families. And when people fight for their families, they do things that professional soldiers would never do. Sarah pointed to a section of the map where several small ships had charged directly into a much larger enemy formation. "Look at this attack pattern. No military academy would teach this tactic because it should result in the complete destruction of the attacking force. But it worked, because the human ships were not trying to preserve themselves. They were trying to create an opening for the rest of the fleet. She moved to another part of the display. And here, the defending fleet retreated in what looks like panic, drawing the enemy ships into a trap. But this was not a planned tactical retreat. The human commander was buying time, using their own ships as bait while civilian transports evacuated people from the planet's surface. The classroom was completely silent now. Sarah could see that her fellow students were beginning to understand her reasoning, even if they did not agree with it. The human commander won this battle, Sarah continued, because they were not fighting to win a military victory. They were fighting to save everyone they loved. And when humans fight for something they love, we become something that your textbooks cannot explain. Professor studied the display for a long moment. This is an interesting theory, Cadet, but do you have any evidence to support your claim that the commander was human? Sarah nodded and brought up the veteran interview she had found. I discovered this memoir in the archives. A crew member who served in the battle mentions that their commander was one of the Earth people and spoke with a North American accent. She displayed additional fragments she had found scattered through various records. There are other small references, but the records from that time period are incomplete. It seems that after the battle, the human commander disappeared from official history. That is convenient, said one of the students. If there are no records, how can you prove your theory? Sarah was about to answer when Professor spoke up. Actually, he said slowly, there are records. They are simply not in the standard military databases. The professor walked to his personal console and entered a series of commands. New information appeared on the display: detailed service records, personal files, and historical documents that Sarah had never seen before. The commander of the defending fleet, Professor announced, was Admiral of the Terran Defense Force. He was indeed human, and he had no formal military training when the war began. He was an engineer who learned warfare out of necessity when his world was threatened. Sarah stared at the new information flowing across the screen. There were photos of Admiral, reports from the battle, and personal logs that she had not been able to access during her research. But something about the name bothered her. It was not a common name, but it was also not completely unusual. Still, something about it felt familiar in a way that made her uncomfortable. Admiral, Professor continued, became something of a legend after the Battle of Crimson Nebula, but he never sought fame or recognition. After the war ended, he returned to Earth and lived quietly until his death some 40 years later. The professor looked directly at Sarah. Your analysis was correct, Cadet, but I suspect you know more about Admiral than you have told us. Sarah felt her heart begin to beat faster. She looked at the photos of Admiral on the display, studying his face carefully for the first time. He was young in the military photos, probably in his 30s, with dark hair and serious eyes. But there was something about his expression, something about the shape of his face, that made her stomach clench with recognition. She thought about her grandfather's old photo albums, the pictures he had never wanted to talk about. Pictures of a young man in an old-style military uniform, standing next to primitive spaceships that looked nothing like modern vessels. Pictures that her grandfather had always said were from before. Sarah's mouth went dry as the truth hit her like a physical blow. She looked up at Professor, who was watching her with an expression that suggested he had known this moment would come. Professor, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, what was Admiral's full name? The professor replied, though his family always called him Tony. Sarah closed her eyes. Her grandfather's name was. He had always told people to call him Tony, and he had always said that his first name was, but he did not like to use it because it reminded him of old times. When she opened her eyes again, she found that everyone in the classroom was staring at her. Professor's expression had changed from academic interest to something that looked almost like concern. "Cadet," he said gently, "do you have something you would like to share with the class?" Sarah stood in the silent classroom, feeling as though the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Everyone was staring at her, waiting for her to say something. Professor's question hung in the air like a challenge she could not avoid. "Cadet," the professor prompted gently, "you seem to recognize Admiral's name." Sarah looked at the holographic display showing her grandfather's young face. Even now, she could see the resemblance that she had never noticed before. The serious eyes, the determined expression, the way he held his shoulders when he was thinking about something important. "Yes, sir," she said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. "I recognize the name because was my grandfather." The classroom erupted in shocked voices. Students turned to each other, speaking rapidly in their native languages. Sarah heard the clicking of mandibles, the musical tones of exclamations, and the sharp whistles of surprise. Professor raised his hand for silence, and the noise gradually died down. "Your grandfather," he repeated slowly. "The admiral who won the greatest tactical victory in galactic history was your grandfather." "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "Though I never knew that until today. He never talked about the war. He just said he had been in the military when he was young, but that it was a long time ago and not important anymore." She looked around the classroom at her fellow students. Some looked shocked, others looked skeptical, and a few looked almost frightened. Sarah realized that for them, Admiral was not just a historical figure. He was the human who had proved that her species could be incredibly dangerous when threatened. "Tell us about him," Professor said. "What was he like as a person?" Sarah smiled slightly, thinking about her memories of Grandpa Tony. "He was the kindest man I ever knew," she said. "He grew tomatoes in his garden behind his house. He taught me how to fix broken machines. He made pancakes every Sunday morning and told me stories about the old days on Earth." She paused, remembering something else. "He never seemed like a warrior to me. He was just Grandpa. He would sit on his porch in the evenings and watch the sunset. He liked old music and old movies. He was always helping neighbors with their problems." "But you must have seen signs of his military background," said, her forearms moving nervously. "Surely he trained you or taught you fighting techniques." Sarah shook her head. "No, nothing like that. He hated violence. He would not even let me play with toy weapons when I was little. He said that fighting should only happen when there was no other choice." "Then how do you explain what he did during the war?" asked. The mandibles were clicking rapidly, showing his confusion. "The tactics he used were incredibly aggressive. He sacrificed hundreds of his own people to achieve victory." Sarah felt a flash of anger at that comment. "He did not sacrifice anyone," she said firmly. "Every person who died in that battle died protecting their families, my grandfather included." She turned back to the holographic display and pointed to the battle data. "You keep thinking about this as a military operation, but it was not. It was ordinary people making an impossible choice. They could surrender and watch their families become slaves, or they could fight and probably die trying to save them." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "My grandfather was not a warrior when this started. He was an engineer working on fusion reactors for civilian power plants. But when the enemy fleet arrived at Earth, someone had to organize the defense. Someone had to take responsibility." She highlighted different sections of the battle map. "Look at these ship movements again. Do you see the pattern? Every single maneuver was designed to protect the civilian evacuation ships, even when it meant sending military vessels on suicide missions." Professor nodded slowly. "Your grandfather chose to prioritize civilian lives over military objectives." "Exactly," Sarah said, "because he was not thinking like a military commander. He was thinking like someone who had promised to protect innocent people, and he meant to keep that promise no matter what it cost." She brought up some of the personal records that Professor had displayed. "Look at his logs from the battle. He is not writing about tactics or strategy. He is writing about the families on the evacuation ships, about the children who needed to reach safety, about the elderly people who could not defend themselves. Sarah read from one of the log entries displayed on screen. Day 3 of the siege. We lost the cruiser Defiant this morning, all hands, but the civilian convoy made it to the jump point safely. Every life saved is worth the price we pay. The classroom was completely quiet now. Sarah could see that her fellow students were beginning to understand something they had not considered before. The greatest military victory in galactic history had not been achieved by military thinking at all. My grandfather told me stories when I was growing up, Sarah continued, but he never told me they were about the war. He would talk about the time when bad people tried to hurt our family and good people had to stop them. He made it sound like a children's story. She smiled at the memory. He used to say that the most dangerous thing in the universe was someone who loved their family more than they loved their own life. He said that kind of person would do anything, risk everything, to keep their loved ones safe. Leaned forward in her seat. Is that how you learned to think like he did, by listening to his stories? Sarah nodded. I think so. He taught me that sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. He taught me that when someone threatens innocent people, you do not calculate odds or worry about military doctrine. You just do whatever it takes to stop them. But what about after the war? Asked one of the students. If he was such a great commander, why did he disappear from public life? Sarah looked at the photos of her grandfather on the display. In the later pictures, taken after the war, his eyes looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. Because he hated what the war had forced him to become, she said quietly. He saved Earth and probably dozens of other worlds, but he also had to make choices that haunted him for the rest of his life. He used to have nightmares sometimes, even when I was little. She paused, thinking about conversations she had overheard between her grandfather and her parents. He never wanted to be remembered as a great military leader. He wanted to be remembered as someone who loved his family. He used to say that the war was not his greatest achievement. Raising his children and watching his grow up was his greatest achievement. Professor studied Sarah carefully. And what did you learn from him, cadet? What lessons did he pass down to you? Sarah thought about that question for a long moment. She remembered her grandfather teaching her to fix broken machines, showing her how to solve problems step by step. She remembered him telling her that the most important thing in life was to protect the people you cared about. He taught me that humans are not naturally violent, she said finally, but we are naturally protective. When someone threatens our family, our friends, our home, we become something different, something that even we do not fully understand. She gestured toward the battle display. The tactics he used in this battle were not learned from military textbooks. They came from something deeper. They came from the absolute refusal to let innocent people suffer when you have the power to stop it. Sarah looked around the classroom at her fellow students. Every species here has their own strengths, have perfect memory, are natural warriors, can see patterns that others miss. But humans have something different. What is that? Asked Professor. We have the ability to become absolutely ruthless when we are protecting someone we love, Sarah said. Not because we enjoy violence, but because the alternative is unthinkable. My grandfather was not a great military genius. He was just a man who loved his family more than he feared death. She pointed to the final battle statistics on the display. He won this battle because losing was not an option, not because of pride or military honor, but because failure meant watching children die. And humans will do literally anything to prevent that from happening. The classroom remained silent for several moments. Sarah could see that her words had affected her classmates in different ways. Some looked thoughtful, others looked uncomfortable, and a few looked genuinely worried. Professor finally spoke. Thank you for sharing this with us, cadet. It provides valuable context for understanding this historical battle. Sarah nodded and sat back down, but she could feel that something in the room had changed. Her fellow students were looking at her differently now, not just as a human cadet who happened to be in their class, but as someone connected to one of the most feared military leaders in galactic history. And she realized that this was exactly what her grandfather had been trying to avoid. He had not wanted to be remembered as someone to be feared. He had wanted to be remembered as someone who protected the innocent. But the galaxy, it seemed, had a hard time forgetting the difference between protection and threat. The silence in the classroom stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the room focused on her, and she was not sure if the attention was curious, respectful, or fearful. Maybe it was all three. Professor broke the silence by walking slowly to the center of the room. His four legs moved with the careful precision that Sarah had learned meant he was thinking deeply about something important. "Cadet," he said finally, "your analysis of the Battle of Crimson Nebula was excellent. You correctly identified both the commander and the motivation behind the victory. But I suspect there is more to this story than what you have told us." Sarah looked up at him confused. "Sir, you spoke about your grandfather with great affection," the professor continued. "You described him as a kind man who grew tomatoes and made pancakes, but you also demonstrated a deep understanding of the tactical thinking that won this battle. Tell me, what else did your grandfather teach you?" Sarah felt uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. She glanced around the classroom and saw that her fellow students were leaning forward in their seats, waiting for her answer. "He taught me a lot of things, sir," she said carefully. "How to fix machines, how to solve problems, how to think through difficult situations." "And did he ever talk about current events, about galactic politics, about the relationships between different species?" Sarah hesitated. Her grandfather had talked about those things, but not in the way that professor seemed to be suggesting. "He taught me to be careful, sir. He said that peace was precious and should never be taken for granted." Professor nodded. "Wise advice. And did he ever express any opinions about humanity's place in galactic society?" Now Sarah was definitely uncomfortable. She could see where this was going, and she did not like it. "He said that humans should be good neighbors and try to get along with everyone. But he also said that we should never forget who we are or where we came from." "And what did he mean by that?" Sarah took a deep breath. She knew that her next words would be important, not just for her final exam, but for how her classmates would think about her and about humans in general. "He meant that humans have been peaceful for 300 years, she said slowly. "We have been good members of galactic society. We follow the laws, we trade fairly, we participate in joint scientific projects. We have not started any wars or caused any major problems." She paused and looked around the room. "But my grandfather also wanted me to remember that our peaceful nature is a choice, not a weakness. He said that humans choose to be peaceful because we have learned what war really costs. But that does not mean we have forgotten how to fight." The reaction to her words was immediate. Sarah heard sharp intakes of breath from several species, and she saw mandibles clicking nervously among the students. One of them made a high-pitched sound that she was pretty sure indicated alarm. "Are you threatening us?" asked, rising from his seat. His posture showed the aggressive stance that took when they felt challenged. Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, sir. I am not threatening anyone. I am just trying to explain what my grandfather taught me about the responsibility that comes with being human." Professor held up his hand to calm the classroom. "Explain that responsibility, cadet." Sarah chose her words very carefully. "My grandfather said that humans have a duty to remain peaceful as long as possible. He said we should always try to solve problems with words instead of weapons, and we should always look for ways to help instead of ways to hurt." She gestured toward the battle display that was still showing the aftermath of Crimson Nebula. "But he also said that if someone threatens innocent people, If someone tries to hurt our families or our friends or our allies, then we have a different duty. We have a duty to stop them, no matter what it costs us." The classroom was completely silent again. Sarah could see that her words were being processed in different ways by different species. Some of her classmates looked thoughtful, others looked worried, and a few looked genuinely afraid. "What you are describing," said carefully, "sounds like you are saying that humans are a sleeping threat, that you appear peaceful but are actually dangerous." Sarah considered that for a moment. "I think," she said finally, "that every species in this room is dangerous when they need to be. Our natural warriors can outthink almost any opponent, can see threats coming from far away. Everyone here has abilities that could be used to hurt others." She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many of her classmates as possible. "The difference is not in our abilities. The difference is in when and why we choose to use them. Most species fight for territory or resources or political advantage. Humans fight for something different." "What do we fight for?" asked Jenny. Sarah realized that her fellow human cadet was asking the question that everyone else wanted to ask but was afraid to voice. "We fight for love," Sarah said simply. "We fight to protect the people we care about. And that makes us different from professional soldiers or political warriors, because love makes people do impossible things." Professor walked closer to Sarah's desk. "And do you believe that this difference makes humans more dangerous than other species?" Sarah thought about her grandfather's stories, about the gentle man who had grown tomatoes and made pancakes, but had also saved an entire world from invasion. "I think it makes us dangerous in a different way," she said. "Most military forces can be defeated by destroying their equipment, cutting their supply lines, or breaking their command structure. But you cannot defeat someone who is fighting for love by using those methods." She pointed to the battle display again. "Look at what my grandfather did. His fleet was completely outmatched. Any rational commander would have surrendered or retreated. But rational military thinking did not apply because he was not just a military commander. He was a father and a grandfather and a neighbor who could not bear the thought of children being hurt." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "That kind of motivation cannot be broken by normal military tactics. You cannot negotiate with it, you cannot intimidate it, and you cannot outlast it. The only way to defeat someone who is fighting for love is to completely destroy them, which means killing everyone they are trying to protect." The implications of what she was saying hung heavy in the air. Sarah could see understanding dawning on the faces of her classmates. They were beginning to realize why the old treaties between Earth and the rest of the galaxy were written with such careful language, why human space remained largely autonomous, why certain diplomatic lines were never crossed. "So what you are telling us," said Professor slowly, "is that humanity remains peaceful because the galaxy has been smart enough not to threaten what humans love." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. As long as our families are safe, our friends are safe, our allies are safe, humans will continue to be the best neighbors anyone could want. We will share our technology, contribute to joint projects, help solve galactic problems, and generally make everyone's life better." She paused and looked directly at Professor. "But if someone makes the mistake of threatening innocent people that humans care about, then they will discover that my grandfather was not unique. He was just the first human that the galaxy got to see when we absolutely could not afford to lose." The professor's mandibles twitched in what Sarah had learned was the equivalent of a thoughtful expression. "And do you believe that other humans share this same capacity for protective violence?" Sarah thought about her parents, her neighbors, the ordinary people she had grown up with on Earth. She thought about how they talked about their children, how they worried about their elderly relatives, how they reacted when they heard about injustice or cruelty happening to innocent people. "Every human I know," she said quietly, "would do exactly what my grandfather did if they were put in the same situation. We would all prefer to solve problems peacefully, But if peace fails and innocent people are threatened, then humans will become something that your military textbooks cannot explain or predict. She looked around the classroom one more time. And I think that is exactly how it should be. The galaxy should be afraid of what happens when humans fight to protect what we love, not because we want to be feared, but because that fear helps keep the peace. Professor nodded slowly and walked back to his position at the front of the room. Thank you, Cadet. That was a very illuminating examination. He turned to address the entire class. Today you have learned an important lesson about the nature of military history and strategic analysis. You have also learned something about the species that you will be working with as officers in the Galactic Defense Force. The professor's voice took on a more formal tone. The Battle of Crimson Nebula was indeed the greatest tactical victory in recorded galactic history, but as Cadet has demonstrated, it was not won through superior technology or advanced military training. It was won through something that cannot be taught in any academy. He gestured toward the battle display. Admiral won this battle because he was fighting for something more important than military objectives or strategic goals. He was fighting for love, and love makes ordinary people capable of extraordinary things. Professor looked directly at Sarah. Cadet, your analysis was excellent and your conclusions were correct. You have passed your final examination with the highest possible marks. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she also noticed that the professor was not finished speaking. However, he continued, I want all of you to remember what you have learned here today. The galaxy has been at peace for 3 centuries, and that peace exists because we all understand and respect each other's capabilities and motivations. His gaze moved around the classroom, taking in students from a dozen different species. Humans like Cadet are our allies and our friends. They contribute enormously to galactic civilization, and we are fortunate to have them as members of our society. But today, you have been reminded that friendship and alliance do not mean weakness. The professor's mandibles clicked once, firmly. The lesson you have learned today is not just about military history. It is about the importance of maintaining the peace that we all enjoy. Because if that peace ever fails, if innocent people are ever threatened again, then the galaxy will rediscover why humans are called the species that fights for love. Sarah sat back in her chair, feeling a complex mixture of pride and unease. She had passed her exam and honored her grandfather's memory, but she had also revealed something about humanity that she was not sure the galaxy was ready to understand. As her classmates filed out of the classroom, many of them avoided making eye contact with her. But a few stopped to nod respectfully, and one of the students even clicked his mandibles in what she recognized as a gesture of acknowledgement. Sarah gathered her belongings slowly, thinking about what her grandfather would have said about this day. She suspected he would have been proud of her academic achievement, but worried about the attention she had drawn to human capabilities. As she reached the door, Professor called her name. She turned back to see him standing by the battle display, which still showed the impossible victory that had made her grandfather a legend. Cadet, he said quietly, your grandfather was a remarkable man, but I suspect that the most remarkable thing about him was not his military genius, but his ability to return to a peaceful life after the war ended. Sarah nodded. He said that anyone could learn to fight. The hard part was learning when to stop. Professor's mandibles twitched in what might have been a smile. Wise words. I hope that wisdom runs in your family. Sarah looked at the holographic image of her grandfather one more time, then walked out of the classroom. She had learned something important today, not just about military history, but about herself and her place in the galaxy. The universe was vast and full of different species with different strengths and different ways of thinking. But somewhere in that vast universe, there would always be humans who grew tomatoes and made pancakes and told bedtime stories to their. And if anyone ever threatened those, the galaxy would remember why love was the most dangerous force in the universe.